As we continue, the internet is buzzing with theories about Annie Guthrie, Nancy Guthrie's daughter, and her husband, Tommaso Cian. Now, many conspiracy theorists have been pointing to the idea that Annie and Tommaso are somehow involved. Law enforcement has explicitly stated that neither Annie or Tommaso have been named suspects or people of interest. Savannah herself has even come out and said that these accusations are unbearable and that they add pain onto pain. Now, these theories started swirling around when authorities went to Annie and Tommaso's house and started seizing evidence at the beginning of this investigation. We even released a picture outside Annie's house where an investigator is walking into the house with a bag over his shoulder containing what is believed to be a forensic extraction device used to access data from smartphones, SIM cards, and more. On top of that, authorities were seen on at least one occasion leaving Annie and Tommaso's house with at least one evidence bag. And it seems now more than ever, though, Annie and Tommaso have been laying low. Here to talk about that with me today is veteran FBI Special Agent Jen Coffendaffer. Jen, thanks so much for joining me. Thank you for having me, of course. So, starting out, Jen, this is really interesting. It seems like the authorities at the beginning of this investigation were zoning in on Annie and Tommaso. Why could that be? Well, I don't interpret that as zoning in on them. What I interpret that as they were the last to see her other than Portuguese, and because of that, that pulls an extra look at them. I mean, they're the last to have seen her, and in addition, they were her caretakers. They were the closest to her. So you always start there with any investigation and move out. And they had to do an extremely thorough job to make sure that either they were involved or weren't involved. And so it was imperative that they be thorough. And what could that have to do with the person using that forensic extraction device? Why were the SIM cards and the computers a point of interest for authorities in this investigation? Well, we all saw those IAC bags, right? And anytime you see that, that is somebody that has a specialty typically used in child abduction cases where you quickly want to extract information. And in a sense, this was no difference other than it had to do with an 84-year-old woman. So their purpose was to as quickly and as expeditiously get that information from all their devices. And that's why IAC was pulled in. Now that we're at this point in the investigation, the authorities have come out. They said they're not looking at Annie and Tommaso. They're not suspects. They're not people of interest. Yet these conspiracy theories still continue to swirl, and it seems like it's led to Annie and Tommaso laying low. Why could that be? Well, look, Annie and Tommaso, since they have had sort of a bead on their forehead since the beginning of this investigation, which I agree with you in large part was because of all of the activity at their house, right? There were multiple searches. There were multiple times that they went into the neighborhood and did what we call canvasses. Clearly, they were looking hot and heavy at them, like I said, to either clear or to determine that they were involved. And when they took the car and it took a long time to give it back, that also led to a lot of suspicion. They gave it back, but they had torn it apart. So, it took quite a lot of time to get it put back together. Nevertheless, the reason I believe they're laying so low right now is because, can you imagine the people still finger-pointing at them? In fact, I used to be able to find Tommaso Cian on their list of teachers at the school that he teaches at. I can't find that anymore. Of course, that could be for a lot of reasons. Maybe they've changed how they do their website. Maybe they are keeping him off of there because of all the heat that school would be taking. Whenever you have a mob of social media conspiracy theorists that believe, no matter what's put out by law enforcement, that somebody's involved, you are going to have a heavy presence of bullying and of trying to find Annie and Tommaso and following them and causing issues. So I think in large part that's why they are laying low. When it concerns the Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos not talking to the Guthrie family, does that raise any red flags for you at all? Yes, it does. Look, at the end of the day, his jurisdiction, he has venue. He 100% is the adjudicating authority in this particular case right now, unless it is determined that Nancy was taken across state lines or across the international border. Venue lies with him. So it makes no sense that as the person responsible for this investigation that he is not communicating with the victim family, and that in fact apparently that has been passed off solely to the FBI, and I think that that is in large part based on all of the issues that have come up with Chief Nanos that we have seen in the news for the last many weeks. That's the sentiment I'm seeing echoed throughout this community that's following this case. It's like at this point in the case, we're 109 days past. Now he's delegating tasks to the FBI. Now he's relinquishing some of that oversight that he has. Now you guys can go and interact with the family. And I think what a lot of people are saying is, hey, dude, if you just did this from day one, maybe there would have been a higher chance that Nancy Guthrie would be found. What do you say to those people that are kind of angry at Chris Nanos? I understand it. I think all of us have the sense of why in the world from day one weren't they 100% involved in the investigation? I totally believe that there were communications. He's talked about that, but they were not allowed to utilize all their resources and to be a full part of the investigation until apparently, according to Kash Patel, day 4. That's a big problem when you have the number one resource in terms of forensic analyzing, in terms of DNA labs, in terms of boots on the ground, number of agents that would have been able to assist. None of it makes sense. The victim witness program that also the FBI has that could have been utilized to help with the family. All of that was not opened up to the Guthrie family and to the investigation until later. So, the frustration is understandable. Chris Nanos has said himself that we are very close to a breakthrough with the DNA evidence that they have, but they have been saying this for over a month now. Do you think that authorities are actually any closer to the breakthrough that Nanos is talking about? With every day that goes by, you get closer, right? Those scientists are working and they're evaluating the hair that they have, and I believe other pieces of evidence as well. I just cannot believe that that is the only DNA that up to 5 labs are working on, and that the lab that was down in Florida was working on for all those weeks that went by before it was transferred to Quantico. Snorts. So because of that, I would say absolutely any day that you work towards solving a case is a day that you get further down the road. But I honestly believe it was more of a brush-off and not a necessarily true sentiment that, listen, we're right on the cusp of solving this case. I think it was more like, yeah, every day we get closer. Now, maybe this isn't your forte, but you just have such admirable insight to this case. There was recently some backlash that Nanos was facing with the Pima County Board of Supervisors, where one of the supervisors moved or motioned to vacate Sheriff Nanos from his position, which ultimately ended up in the Board of Supervisors voting 4-0 with one abstention in favor of not vacating him. They were looking at things like his leadership, his relationship with personnel on his team. They were looking at his finances, as they were looking at how he's handled past investigations. How, considering his conduct with this case, does that outcome to fruition? I tell you what, did a lot of research on this, and the bottom line is that board has no legal authority to remove him. They have legal authority to remove him only if he refused to answer those questions and did not answer the questions that they posed to him timely. He submitted a 22-page report regarding answers to the questions that the board had, and he did it within the time frame that was allotted. Because of that, that tied their hands. There was nothing they could do. So, he's an elected official. Elected officials are not treated as appointed officials. Elected officials because it's the people's vote. That's what it's thought to be. And when you look at that, you do not want to undo what the people of Pima County want. And that's how they look at him. He was elected only about 2 years ago, and they do not have the power to undo. Jen, thanks so much for joining me. You're absolutely fantastic as always. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you. The logistical challenges of this investigation extend far beyond the immediate evidence-gathering process, highlighting a broader breakdown in administrative cohesion between local and federal authorities. When local law enforcement maintains primary jurisdiction, the reluctance to relinquish control or immediately integrate federal resources often creates a siloed environment where critical information fails to flow efficiently. This friction is not merely theoretical, it manifests in the tangible delay of forensic breakthroughs and the alienation of a family that is already grappling with the trauma of an active, unresolved disappearance. The frustration voiced by the community, specifically regarding the timeline of the FBI's full integration into the case, underscores a valid concern that institutional pride or bureaucratic hesitation can inadvertently compromise the search for truth, turning a time-sensitive investigation into a prolonged waiting game that exacerbates public skepticism. Furthermore, the public's fixation on the periphery of the case, specifically regarding potential suspects who have already been cleared, represents a failure in the communication loop between the sheriff's office and the general public. When law enforcement provides vague, periodic updates that lack substantive details, they create a vacuum that is inevitably filled by speculation and online conspiracy theories. This phenomenon transforms into a social weapon, manifesting as real-world harassment of individuals who are ostensibly innocent. The tragedy here is that the focus shifts from finding the missing person to monitoring the movements of those who have already been ruled out, effectively diverting energy that could be better spent on independent analysis of the actual evidence. This pattern of harassment also reveals the vulnerability of our digital age, where a person's professional existence can be erased overnight due to unsubstantiated online sleuthing that refuses to respect the boundary between investigative curiosity and targeted bullying. Ultimately, the limitations of the Pima County Board of Supervisors in managing the sheriff's tenure demonstrate the rigid nature of elective accountability. Because the office is held by a mandate from the voters, the mechanisms for removal are intentionally narrow, designed to prevent political volatility from disrupting established law enforcement structures. However, this creates a difficult paradox. The public can be acutely aware of a leader's shortcomings in transparency or investigative efficacy, yet remain unable to influence the immediate course of that leadership until the next election cycle. This tension is magnified in a case involving an 84-year-old woman, where the emotional stakes are so high that any perception of procedural inefficiency or administrative neglect is amplified tenfold. As the community continues to wait for the promised DNA breakthrough, the lack of a clear, unified voice from the sheriff's office remains the primary catalyst for the swirling discontent and the pervasive sense that justice is being outpaced by politics. The procedural landscape of this case has become increasingly complicated by the intersection of high-stakes criminal investigation and local political volatility. As the investigation enters its 16th week, the transition of all liaison duties from the Pima County Sheriff's Department to the FBI marks a significant shift, effectively formalizing the distance between Sheriff Chris Nanos and the family of Nancy Guthrie. This development follows a period of mounting public and administrative pressure, during which the Pima County Board of Supervisors investigated Nanos over his employment history and potential perjury, though they ultimately lacked the legal mechanism to remove him from his elected position. The ongoing frustration stems from a sense that this transition should have occurred much earlier, potentially providing the family with the comprehensive resources and support they required from the onset. Furthermore, the investigative theory surrounding the wrench attack, a concept where cybercriminals move from digital extortion to physical kidnapping, has emerged as a point of significant analysis for former law enforcement officials. While this theory offers a chilling potential motive, the Sheriff's Department has remained guarded, stating they have no reports of such attacks in the community. This communication gap between law enforcement's official statements and the external analysis provided by experts has created a vacuum, often filled by, and fueling, intense speculation. The public's focus on the initial searches of relatives' homes and the lack of a named suspect continues to cast a shadow over the proceedings, as investigators maintain that they are still processing a massive volume of forensic and digital evidence in hopes of a breakthrough. The underlying tension persists not just because of the mystery of the disappearance, but because of the cloud of controversy surrounding Sheriff Nanos himself. With perjury allegations now referred to the Arizona Attorney General for further review, the department finds itself in a state of dual crisis, managing a high-profile, unsolved abduction while simultaneously defending its leadership against institutional and political scrutiny. For the community and the Guthrie family, the situation remains a stark example of how the lack of a unified, transparent investigative voice can exacerbate trauma and delay the sense of justice that an 84-year-old mother and her family deserve. Pima County Sheriff faces calls to resign. HTTPS www.youtube.com/watch VCSRMJTSRQPA. This video provides important context regarding the political pressure and controversies surrounding Sheriff Chris Nanos, which have become a central element of the public discussion regarding the investigation. The case of 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie, missing from her Tucson home since February 1, 2026, has evolved into a complex narrative that reflects the worst anxieties of a community under duress. Now exceeding 110 days, the investigation has become a focal point for both legitimate procedural scrutiny and the darker, less predictable consequences of digital-age true crime obsession. The recent installation of physical barriers, poles, chains, and no trespassing signage at the Guthrie residence serves as a stark visual metaphor for the siege mentality that has gripped the neighborhood. What began as a tragic kidnapping has, for the residents of Catalina Foothills, morphed into a recurring nightmare that echoes the community's historical trauma from the 1980s. This atmosphere of fortress living, where citizens are once again wary of their own homes, has created a fertile ground for the rumor mill to churn, often at the expense of those who are merely tangential to the investigation. Central to this volatility is the embattled leadership of Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos. The sheriff is currently navigating a dual-front crisis, a high-profile stalled abduction case that has drawn international attention, and a political uprising led by county supervisors who are leveraging long-standing allegations of perjury and past misconduct to demand his resignation. The sheriff's recent claim that the department is close to a breakthrough regarding DNA evidence found at the scene has been met with skepticism by both the public and legal experts, particularly given the procedural friction between his office and the FBI. Reports that evidence was initially processed by private laboratories before being moved to Quantico have only fueled accusations of administrative incompetence and delayed cooperation. For the Guthrie family, the administrative shadowboxing between local and federal agencies has been an agonizing hurdle, transforming their personal tragedy into a piece of political theater. Furthermore, the internet's relentless focus on the periphery of the case, specifically the lives of family members who have already been cleared, has led to a dangerous blurring of lines between investigative transparency and harassment. The recent online excavation of Annie Guthrie's past literary dedications and the subsequent unsubstantiated scrutiny of her marriage to Tommaso Cioni illustrate how social media can weaponize personal details to create a narrative of guilt where none exists. This sleuthing culture, characterized by the tracking of private individuals and the doxing of their professional affiliations, has effectively forced the family to retreat into a state of semi-isolation, further complicating the flow of information between the public and law enforcement. As the investigation continues, the absence of a proof of life or a confirmed suspect has left a vacuum that is increasingly being filled by digital mob behavior rather than objective, evidence-based inquiry. Ultimately, the standoff between Sheriff Nanos and the Board of Supervisors highlights a significant systemic limitation: the difficulty of removing an elected official who has lost the public's trust but remains insulated by the rigid framework of democratic election cycles. While the Board of Supervisors has expressed deep concern regarding the sheriff's credibility, their inability to force a vacatur, due to Nanos's timely response to their inquiries, has left the community in a state of political paralysis. As investigators continue to sift through the DNA confetti recovered from the scene, the case remains defined by this persistent tension between the desperate need for closure and the slow, often opaque gears of institutional justice. With the investigation now firmly in the hands of the FBI, the public remains caught in a precarious state of waiting, hopeful for a resolution, but increasingly cynical about the leadership that has presided over these 110 days of uncertainty.